Okay, so as everyone's coming back in, I just want to first open it up. We'll get into some particular points I want to discuss in a moment, but I'd like to see if there's any kind of main points, considerations, challenges that folks were sharing in the groups. And so maybe first, let's go to the group. I think Dorji, Carissa, Melchiad, I think you're in one group. If you'd like to share any kind of key kind of reflection points or main challenges that emerged in your conversation.
Well, I think we did actually, although with very limited, I think they were very interesting things to share. And two of my friends have shared their views on, I mean, their the research questions that they have in mind and the research methods that I think both of them are doing participatory research action. And I think I should also do the participatory research, but I think I want to be more when I do participatory research, but I think I'm also talking about from a point of view of ethnography, because I just want to be part of the people. I just don't want to throw questions to them and get their views, but I want to be part of them, and then maybe most of the time I want to find the answers myself, and maybe being one of them by virtue of being a Buddhist, and then the culture is being rampant in our own society. I think it gives me an advantage to actually do ethnographic research.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great point, what you raised, Dorji, in terms of, if you're conducting more ethnographic research, that as part of that you can also be directly engaging in participatory action research methods, right? That as part of the ethnography, right? If that's like kind of the main focus, you can also have these, participatory activities that are woven within that. And so, it's a great opportunity as you're articulating that, it doesn't have to be either or, right? Like it's kind of yes and in doing that ethnographic approach of instead of that, very kind of 1950s traditional ethnography that was like very top down, right? Of I'm just going to observe you kind of thing, that where it's evolved is into a much more participatory process, right? So of ethnography as kind of your main framework, that within that having these participatory activities. And so I appreciate the way you kind of articulate that too, of how we might think about bridging some of these together. Melchiad, yeah.
I have an issue about writing the background of the social research method proposal, because I'm working on my native region, rural county, where I was born and grown. I'm aware of general information, but I don't find the references, because Burundian society has oral tradition. When I write the general information that I know, it appears that is my opinion. That is what I have as issue. And about the research method, I selected to use participatory action research because the research that I'm doing is not about a specific community, is not to understand the community culture. I think that, and I want to provide the people opportunity to produce knowledge and be aware of the process. And I want also to empower them. That is why I selected that method.
Yeah, no, that's definitely helpful to think on, Melchiad. I think, and to go to your first point, in that whenever, and you're definitely not alone in that, right? When we're talking about when you're coming from places that are embedded in oral tradition and oral history, and that is where the information comes from and is passed down. There's a few things there. One is that especially if this is where you're from, that your own expertise and knowledge is valid knowledge, right? That it's articulating as such and explaining that where this information comes from, right? So if you're putting information forward that, say, doesn't have a reference with it, it's explaining it carefully that, you know, that this is where I'm from what's been the knowledge that's been passed down to me. That, so it's not just even opinion, right? This is what's been shared through that oral tradition. And so as long as it's making very clear where that information is coming from. And now in terms of bringing in, because there's also an issue, you know, in, for example, in academic literature, there's a quote peer review process, right? So if you go to publish something, then it goes through what's known as peer review. And the problematic colonial nature of this is that expertise is deemed because you ask two of your friends to review some article and they sign off and say, okay, this is peer reviewed expert knowledge, versus looking at what's been actually passed down for generations through a family, through a community, and understanding what really is peer review and what really is expert knowledge. And so it's always just making sure that it's clear where the information is coming from. So in this instance, you know, through our oral history, through our oral traditions, this is the information I have, right? So as long as that's clear. In terms of bringing in other literature, say where I'm asking you for references, you can certainly do that other places, and it doesn't have to be in your exact context. So for example, if I was interested in using, so last week we talked about photo voice, right, as a research method. If I was interested and wanted to use photo voice as a research method, that I would have, I could bring in a couple of articles talking about photo voice, right? And that's what you would be citing. Or you can also look at, instead of just your place in particular, here's a question I have. And now here is maybe research elsewhere that's been done that relates to this, right? That you could draw and from and connect to. And then there's also looking at, for example, if you do have access, and this could be maybe not in the exact location, but within the country, if there are any, say, for example, community-based organizations, any nonprofit, NGOs, if there's any you know, government reporting that is available, that any, you know, if say there's a national NGO, and if they have a website, or they don't even necessarily have to have a website, if they have some sort of material information to draw from, or a way that they've communicated out. And this doesn't always have to be written. This can also be through, for example, if there's a radio station that people might tune into, right? And maybe information tends to be conveyed through radio, right? Of that is perfectly okay to be including, right? And so in thinking about how to bring in other reference material, it doesn't just have to be kind of for that background part. And so the key really is just being really clear where any information is coming from. And if it's coming from your own knowledge and your own background, of foregrounding that to explain that, you know, this is the community I'm from. This is where I grew up. And so this is the information, the knowledge that's been passed down to me, just so it's clear where any of that is coming from. And so that works perfectly well. And then what you're describing in terms of kind of that it's not your focus isn't on one specific community, you know, that there's kind of two approaches sometimes people take, right? They look at, okay, here is a specific community or area that I'm just really drawn to, or where I'm from, and this is where I'm really interested in, and I'm going to see what's going on there, right? So some people might start with that place, right? And I want to focus on this place, and then I'll see what's there is important to focus on, what questions are emerging. Or you can look at, okay, here is a question I have. This is an issue I'm particularly interested in. And then where does it make sense to look at that issue, right? And it doesn't have to be just one place. And so, you know, what you're speaking to is a bit more of the issue focused, right? And so it's starting from that point as to here's the issue that you know, I really want to focus in on, and then where does it map to kind of be investigating that, if you will. So those are excellent points. Any other thoughts, reflections to raise from this group? Okay, I think we'll go to the next group. I think was Amar, Kristen, Austin.
Yeah, so I can just quickly say that we all in common had this same problem of, you know, locals in rural areas not being similarly educated on government groups and entities, and that made them uncomfortable. So we all had that commonality.
So can you say a little more on that in terms of kind of how that thinks about like of how to kind of reshape your research, or how to bring that understanding into kind of if you need to reimagine your approach?
Yeah, and Amar stated it really well, but when he was meeting with his groups, he basically there was a learning curve to kind of catch people up on what the government groups were up to, and what their purpose was and how it affected them, just so they understood kind of how to answer some of those research questions.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so this is a really kind of a common issue, as you probably imagine, with all three of you facing it, that, you know, especially if you're bringing, say, for example, if you're bringing a very specific select group of people together who are all going to be coming from kind of the same understanding background, or at least some base knowledge, right? That's one thing, but that's not typically what's going to happen. Often, especially if you're bringing groups of people together, say in a focus group, that people are going to be coming in with all different levels of understanding and background information and knowledge. And so this becomes really important, again, in kind of where we look at pilot testing our questions sometimes, because we want to see, you know, is this clear to someone who may not have that background information? Is it clear in even the language being used, right? Sometimes we get in our very silos of what we focus on and language that we use and how we articulate things, not just for acronyms, but the way that we might say something, does that actually translate if you're not really deeply embedded in that field? Right? If you're, say, for example, I know a couple of folks are focused on sustainable agriculture, right? There's certain language around that. And if you're not well-versed in that, you might think you're asking a pretty simple, direct question, but sometimes just the actual language used can matter. And then also thinking about, is there kind of background information material you want to provide to start with so that everyone has at least some base level understanding in common. So say, for example, I do a lot of climate adaptation planning work with communities. And so, and you know, when we do interviews with more like managers, right, with staff, right, that they're coming from a different understanding and perspective, right? So we kind of start at a different place. Whereas when we're bringing people from across the community together, if it's elders and youth and different community members, right, that we start off with some basic kind of groundwork of when we're talking about, in this case, climate adaptation, right? So that everyone in that conversation at least has this same base kind of information that's being shared at the very beginning. And so that's where you kind of have to think about too, right? Like, of kind of who you're really engaging with in this. And as Austin shared, it comes back to understanding that your understanding of the issue may not be the perspective of the general community. As someone who's involved in political and community work, you see the issue one way, and the community's perspective may run up against the assumptions that you've made about whatever the issue is. Exactly. So Austin, you just hit it so on the mark, in that one of the big challenges of participatory work is that you are innately involved in this, right? You are not removed from it. You are part of it. And what becomes complicated in that is not only to think about how you might be shaping that, but also of are your own perspectives, knowledge, beliefs, right? Are they driving the question, not just the questions, but are they driving what emerges from those questions, right? Because if you're kind of filtering everything, right, through your understanding. And so this becomes where we have to really think about this full, what we've talked about, kind of that action research cycle, right? Becomes really important in the process of sharing back results with the community, iterating over that, allowing them time and space to have input, so that it's not just, okay, I'm going in, I'm collecting information, I'm analyzing that, and now I'm outputting it, right? As to say, this is what the results are. That's not the participatory PAR approach, right? That's more of kind of a traditional research approach, where the difference here is that people are engaged as active participants in the entire cycle of the research, which not only includes data collection, it also includes even the development of the questions, of deciding what methods to use, how to go about them. And then also, after data is collected, it's about being in dialogue over what those results are. Not that anyone is, you know, that, oh, we're gonna say, oh no, that's not really what came out, but that because you're, say, for example, when you're doing that qualitative analysis, and if you're setting up, this is what the codes and the categories and the themes that I'm going to be looking for, right? One step in that is to go over together, say with your participants, with your team, are these the codes to use, right? Are these even the themes to be using? Does this make sense to others, right? Having conversations around that. So at each stage, you're really looking at, and it takes time. Right, we're going to get to this in a moment, kind of the timeline. I know this came up in all of the groups, but of a true participatory process, it can be, you know, agonizing at times, because it can be very painstakingly meticulous, because to be truly participatory, of thinking about every step along, not just your research question, not just developing your methods, not just here's the analysis, right? Now here's the outcomes, of all those sub steps in between, and how you're really coordinating and working together on that, if we're looking at it as kind of a truly participatory, engaged approach. Okay, let's go to the last group. I think we had Fabienne, Maher, Lidette, Robert. if anyone would like to share out from your group.
Sorry about that. Couldn't figure out the unmute. Well, our group was facing, I wouldn't say facing the same challenges, but we discussed a combination of the same approaches, qualitative and quantitative, in terms of research, where some of us at the stages of revising what we originally had intended, or putting it into a kind of a, how do we focus this into this social research project? So I know that the debt was advanced in that, and I know Fabian was also considering a more participatory approach, and then someone else was using more ethnographic, I think, approach. I am, let's see, I'm using, I believe, a more participatory approach, which I think that's what's needed. And I think we're realizing sometimes the scope of the question can be so big, and how to focus it, at least for the purpose of this kind of a launching pad mode that we're in. So we have to, I think at the end, we just kind of remembered that we have to just remember that where we are, it's just the foot of the mountain. And then the launching pad will be this, and then refocusing in for some, and I hope I would be one of those, shaping this research for toward this degree, or even, really toward actually making change, and making that change. And it delves into ethical questions, and for some of our group members, they've shared there's even security questions in terms of personal security, so some of their research puts them in danger. So there's real difficult work to do, and I really learned a lot from that, I think, from that sharing.
Thank you for sharing that out, Robert. And I love that articulation of being at the foot of the mountain, right? And also, that really speaks to, this is why I've kind of maybe over harped on it, but the need to just keep honing in on your research question, right? Because we start out here, right? And then we start to zoom in, and then very quickly it goes back out. And so by, as you go down the road on your research, a year, 2 years, whatever time out, that you're probably going to have a different question than what you started with. And one of the hardest things to do is to kind of let go of that question. But you have to always be revisiting it to see, well, what's actually emerging? What is actually the question to be asked? And that also helps you continue to hone in, because you realize as you go into it, what seemed like narrow enough, right, and specific enough is really still covering the whole world of possibilities, right? And so this is where we keep honing back into that research question. And a couple of points you said that kind of two general things I wanted to mention, with which I heard come across from every group, was really the timeline in carrying out social research methods and doing social and engaged research, in that it's going to be a very unsatisfactory answer, but flexibility is always going to be the biggest key. And the one thing you can be certain of is that whatever timeline you lay out will change. So that's probably very unsatisfying, but it will change. And I think also, as you get more into this kind of work, you start realizing what is more of a realistic timeline. So things that you lay out that, okay, this is what we're going to do in 6 months from January to June, you start realizing, actually, that's an 18-month process. When you start looking, because you have to account for each period of time, and it's not just your time, right? It's those with whom you're engaging, and recognizing this is also happening in the context of people's everyday lives and lived experiences, right? And things happen, right? Events happen outside of anyone's control. That is always going to shift and change things. And so that for most of it, if we're really doing this in a participatory way, like, you don't have control over that, right? And it could be things related to, you know, like kind of those family things of deaths, of new jobs, of moving, of things going on with the kids, you know, whatever that might be. It can also be thinking about if you're working in more of a community that's, say, more subsistence based, right? Thinking about subsistence times of the year, right? If you know, if I'm working with, say, with a fishing community, right? I have to consider when are the key harvesting times, right? You have to, you know, if you're working with a hunting community, you know, whatever it might be, that becomes really important. If there's certain ceremonies and practices throughout the year, right? If people migrate seasonally, right? So there might be a period of time, say, where there's a significant portion of people who might not be there, or the opposite, an influx of people, depending on where you are, right? And so all of those factors have to be accounted for so that you think about what you can do during different periods of time. So say, for example, if I know for the next month, I'm not going to be able to, you know, really interview anyone or have really in-depth conversations because everyone's going to be out shrimping. Well, what are the things that we could be doing then during that time, right? So it's kind of, that's what you have to think about too when you start, and as you start mapping that out, so you don't feel like, okay, we got to this point now, everything's stopped because this is what's happening, or everything stopped because this one person had to travel for some family things the next 2 weeks, right? That you're mapping those things out so that you also have what are the elements that you can be working on, so that it does continue on. And so really mapping your research with the lived reality. There are certain things you can predict, right? Like if there's often seasonal migration, if there's, like I said, subsistence seasons, right? Those things you can predict. And then of course, there's the things you cannot predict. Right. And so having kind of that running list too, of here's what we can be working on and doing, even if we're not able to, say, directly engage at this point. And that also then goes back to, and this came up in at least 2 of the groups, I think maybe the third I caught it as well, of thinking about, is it even beyond even just kind of thinking about that, like there's the safety considerations, but also thinking about the timing of doing your research of, for example, you know, I had set out for research that I was going to be doing in a region of West Africa, and what I needed to be doing kind of at the border that I needed to be at, and really what I need to be engaging in. The timing of it was just aligning with just immense civil unrest and conflict that was erupting at that time. And it was very clear, and this felt really important, that like we had to engage in this work. And what I came to realize was that what we needed to do was let go of the research part, right? That we could be engaged in more activism and just as human beings, right? But that the research needed to not be there at that time. Not to say it could never be, but there's also that reality too. And sometimes there is going to be a point in time where it's going to be appropriate to be doing the research, and then sometimes where it's going to have to be let go. There's also thinking about, you know, this is my plan for how to do it, and thinking, gosh, because of what's happening, because of this unrest, because of what's going on in this current context, it makes it even more important to do, right? So that can also happen. And then it's thinking about, okay, well, what are the ways to do this that are going to be the safest approach, right? So it might be continuing with the research, but not as you first envisioned it, right? And so maybe it's engaging with different groups of people. It's how you can adjust it so that it works in a way that is going to mitigate risk as much as possible. And this is where it becomes really important, also thinking about not just your own risk, but those with whom you're engaging with. And I know we talked about this kind of a few weeks ago, but just in the context too, the importance of where you do have a responsibility as the researcher, and this is where things like the informed consent come in, is that if people are giving permission, say, for example, they want their actual name used in something, they want their name out there. you have to take responsibility and sometimes even say, actually, we need to make it anonymous, even if they're adamant about that, right? That's going to be a conversation together, right? Because you need to be accountable as well for their risk. And so those are conversations, very honest conversations you have to have with people, right? When it comes down even to things like whether to use someone's name or not. And so I just saw what Austin had put in too, in terms of participatory research is a matter of sharing control, and kind of learning as to what is unpredictable. And so absolutely right. If this is not a, it is not a 9-to-5 job, right? Where you can predict, I'm going to show up to work at 9 and this is the meeting I'm going to have. And then we're going to do this. And then I have to work on this and I'm going to go, right? Like, the one thing you can predict is that it is completely unpredictable and ever shifting and changing, and it can be unsettling and uncomfortable, right? And that's okay. That it's knowing that it's not that you're doing something wrong, right? That's the nature of the work that you're getting into. And so, that's where we really think also about, so the timing of this. So again, of not just the full timeline, but even when to start things of I'm not gonna get started in the middle of when a whole bunch of folks are migrating during this time of year, or I'm not gonna get started in the middle of their major subsistence gathering time, right? Or, this is like, I really wanna be engaging with this community or something, and COVID is just devastating the community right now. So you know what, we're not going to be doing this right now. Doesn't mean we never will, but maybe we need to wait a year. Or is there some sort of conflict or civil unrest happening where if it's at like a real peak of a moment, do we need to hold off? Or if that actually warrants the need to engage more, what are the steps being taken to mitigate risk? Which also includes really considering how your data is being held secure. So that's kind of the other part of the security, as to how is that information and data that you're collecting, where is it being held, who has access to it, how do there need to be copies made, should there never be copies of anything, right? Of, is this held, if it's held digitally, how is that being secured? Right, I've been in plenty of situations where you can't quite predict how information might get taken, right? So what are all the measures being assured to secure that data and information to the extent possible, right? So really think about how we're safeguarding the information being collected, and especially safeguarding if there's people's names, and safeguarding any sensitive information, right? So also being very clear about what information should never be shared, right? So because when you're deeply engaging with people, things are going to be shared that are going to be sensitive, that are going to be confidential, that should never leave that space, right? So what are the safeguards and guarantees to make sure, to the extent possible, that that information is safe and does not go anywhere it shouldn't? And so this isn't to spook you out of doing this work, right? It's to think about how this is a process, right? That it's not, I'm going to show up and we're going to do some interviews and we're going to do some activities together, and then I'm going to analyze it, and that's our data, right? Like this is a long ongoing process, and even just to set it up to the point where you can start collecting data, right? So much of that, that's why I said it's a little bit kind of a farce doing it in this timeline of a course, right? Because really the heart of so much of what you'd be doing in this kind of work is before any data is ever collected, before any interview is ever done, before any survey is ever distributed. That is where so much of the work comes into play, is before that ever happens. Saying that, I know that we are just about out of time, so I want to be sure So everyone is clear. So by Monday evening university time, you are to be turning in your project proposal. Yes? Thumbs up. Okay. And so next week, so for the remaining 2 weeks, we're going to be doing the our presentations in class. So we won't get to everyone next week. We'll go through as many as possible, but there will be a couple of you who will need to go the following week. Saying that to make it fair, that everyone should be prepared to go next week. Okay, so come prepared to go next week. By Wednesday, you need to be uploading into Moodle any visual that you're going to use for the presentation, because I want to be sure to be able to have it pulled up and have everything ready to go so that it'll flow well during our session. Okay. And so what we'll do is, it's not going to be the most sophisticated, but I will just pull your name out of a hat as to who will be going next, because that's kind of the most fair way I can think to make it. So does anybody have any questions at all kind of on what the expectations are coming up here in terms of getting your project proposal in and in terms of your presentation? And please, please, please make sure you're reviewing those instructions and the presentation. I highly suggest a script and timing yourself, because I do take the 5 minutes seriously, because it's not just oh, this is a rough estimate. It's one, because we need to be able to go through everyone, but also to have 5 minutes to really state very clearly, here's my research question, here's the context, and here is kind of the key kind of message that I want to share, right? So reviewing those instructions very carefully for the presentation too, in terms of what the expectations are. So any questions at all on any of that?
Is this just an image? I don't know why I'm asking the most tried question. Is this just an image that's going to be floating while we're speaking?
Yeah, so it's, if you want to have, if you have any PowerPoint slides, or if there's like a photograph, that you want to use, that anything that like kind of adds value to the presentation, that you would want to have included. So that way I can have it pulled up with when you're going to be presenting. So yeah, format for the presentation is really, it's like, 5 minutes where you're here. Actually, I'll put in, let's see, I'm gonna put this into the chat. This is from I have this up in the presentation instructions, where really, I'm actually asking you to introduce the topic and the community for your proposed research methods project, communicate the research, how the research will be used as a tool for social change, and then you're creating an accompanying visual that kind of clearly communicates the background context and your proposed research plan. And so in the context of your proposed research plan, that might be, say, for example, the methods that you're planning to use, keeping in mind that 5 minutes goes fast. So it's not that you're not giving a full summary of your entire research proposal, but here's kind of the key points that you want to be hitting on. So if you were kind of presenting that proposal at like kind of a high level way, right? So what do folks really need to know? Your research question, need to know, where the focus is, if there's any background to share on that community, and kind of mapping out what are the research methods that you're planning on using. Other questions? Okay, well, I will be available. So questions come up, I will be manning my email. And if just in the coming few days here, anyone needs to just hop on touch base of either over Zoom or WhatsApp, we can certainly do so.
I
Yeah.
did- Small question regarding when the grading will be available. It's part of how I need to get my tuition reimbursement. So I know it's a personal one. And so I expect.
So do you mean like your final submitted grades?
Sure, yeah. I think.
So the final submitted grades, because I'm asking you for these this week. So then the next week will be your e-learning portfolio. So I'm aiming to have, as long as folks have turned things in, I'm aiming to have your grades by, that would be like June 4th. Would be, because the last day of class is June 3rd.
Right.
Does that work?
I will. Yeah, I was getting the HR person asking me. I said a couple of weeks from now, so I will keep her posted. I hope.
Okay.
I will keep.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and check in with Paula or Kelly. I think technically, actually have until like people have until like probably June 18th ish, maybe, to post grade. So I don't want to speak for anything. Yeah.
I think even the projected one would be okay, but anyway, first get this.
So I should have, because of how we've laid this out, I should have all of yours up, as long, as supposed to have gotten things in, that I should have it up by, that would be like June 4th. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much.
For sure. And yeah, so just anything that's coming up, y'all, along the way, let me know and we can talk it out. Okay. I'm excited to see what you're putting out there. All right. Well, be well, and I will see you next week. All right. Take care, everyone.